Well, hi everyone, and this is the complicated session after lunch where blood is flowing to the stomach for digestion instead to the brain. But I'm going to try to keep up with the excellent presentations of my colleagues over here, and hopefully we can make it through this last presentation of the session. So first of all, I would like to start by thanking UNU-WIDER for the invitation. I also form part of the UN. I work in the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And we're very grateful for this invitation to present part of the work that we've been developing in the last 4 years on trying to assess and estimate some macro fiscal effects of climate change in Latin America and the Caribbean. The work that I'm going to be presenting today is an adaptation of a chapter that we presented last year in our fiscal panorama of Latin America and the Caribbean. I brought some copies of, this is the new one, fresh out of the oven, came out 2 weeks ago. You can find some copies out there. And this is our main flagship that we have in the Division on Fiscal Policy, in which we try to bring these policy questions for a regional audience in Latin America and the Caribbean. And basically, in our case, the motivation is a policy motivation. So we work mostly with countries, and we wanted to create this, to start working these estimates for countries in the region, for ministries of finance in the region, to have an approximation to assess the fiscal risks that will come through climate change, right? So let me start with that. Basically, what we are doing in this work, which we're in the process of publishing, and it should be ready by the end of the year. So basically, in this policy paper, what we're doing is we're considering 2 scenarios of temperatures rising in the region. We went through through the literature, and we decided to run 2 scenarios. One with a 2.4 degree increase in temperature until the year 2100, and a second one which seemed like something likely that could happen in the region, and a second one, a more catastrophic one, with an increase of 4.9 degrees Celsius until 2100. And basically the reason behind this is because in the region we're price takers. We emit around 8% of global emissions. So big changes in the emissions and in rising temperatures in the world, yes, of course, the region needs to contribute, but the big changes are going to come from elsewhere. So it's important that countries in the region have estimates of how these scenarios could these risks could potentially materialize in the future. So basically, with these 2 scenarios, we use a good old-fashioned Cobb-Douglas production function to estimate what would be the growth trajectories of these countries. We estimate first the trajectory of total factor productivity, and then knowing that trajectory and with the dynamics in capital and labor, we estimate the growth trajectory going forward to 2050. And then after that, we realize that, well, we have a gap, and we're going to see this in the results. We have a gap in the growth trajectories going forward. So what would be the investments needed to close that gap between both trajectories? And it's going to be a large amount of investment, and that's where the carbon tax comes in. So what are the other possible sources of revenues that we could explore from the public side in order to create financing support for these climate investments? And that's where we bring in the carbon tax. So we do this work for 6 countries in the region: the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Honduras, Jamaica, Paraguay, and Peru. And this is the first result that I wanted to show you. So when we do these projections of total factor productivity, yes, it's obvious, it's going to come down, according to our estimates, going towards 2050, towards the year 2050, under the 2.4 degree scenario, total factor productivity will fall by -1%. And in the 4.9 degree scenario, it would fall by -1.6%. Of course, we know this variable, we have capital, we have labor, and we run the projection of growth in the region, and we land that in 2050, we would expect growth to fall as an average for these 6 countries in the 2.4 degree scenarios to 1% a year, and in the 4.9 degree scenario to 0.2% a year. So then the next question is, and this is where it comes handy, so what would be the investment that we would need to close that gap? if we're assuming that the 2.4 degree scenario is a likely scenario. And as you can see, and probably expect, investments are going to be very high. I'm going to be focusing again on the averages just because of time, but we have to consider an average for these 6 countries in the region right now. They invest on average 21% of GDP. According to our estimates, during the current decade, they would have to increase this investment by 5 percentage points of GDP. During the next decade, in the 2030s, they would have to increase it by a further 3 percentage points of GDP. And by the following decade, 2040, we would have to increase it by an additional 6 percentage points of GDP. So we're saying that by the decade of 2040, these countries would need to be investing 35% of GDP, a huge amount of investment, only to keep up with that less bad growth trajectory on a 2.4 degree temperature rise scenario. Now, the following question is, okay, well, from the public sector, since we work with countries, is there fiscal space for them to even consider part of financing this huge investment? And the answer is no. The region has a very tight fiscal space. Basically, debt has been growing in the region for the last 13 years. We have added about 20 percentage points of GDP in debt throughout this period, even before COVID. As you can see, COVID went up, but the trend came before that. And with this larger amount of debt, interest payments have gone up. Well, of course, worsening financial conditions have also contributed to this. But what we can see is that in the last 12 years, the region, on average, has been paying, or has had to pay 1.2 percentage points of GDP additional on interest payments. And the bad side of the story is that the adjustment variable has been capital expenditure. So public investment has gone down. So given this very tightened fiscal space, we look for other possible sources of financing. And here's where the carbon tax comes in handy, and it's related to what Julian was presented to those questions at the end. Let's first look at what are the carbon tax experiences in the region. So basically in the region we have 5 countries that have a current carbon tax: Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Uruguay. The first 4 cases, basically they legislated a carbon tax past 2014. In the case of Uruguay, it's an adjustment that they have on an excise tax on fuels, where they put a duty on the amount of CO2 emissions from the fuel. So that's why you see those very high differences in price. In general, in the region, the first 4 countries have a carbon price of around $5 per ton, a little bit more, a little bit less, but around there. And then Uruguay has this huge price of $167 per ton, right? But the second thing to analyze is what are the tax bases. So in general, tax bases are quite narrow. As you can see, on average, between these 5 countries, we're talking about 29% of emissions are covered by the carbon tax. We compare that to first-generation carbon tax countries. It's not half, but close to half. And the result of this is that revenues from the carbon tax are very low. We're talking about less than 0.05 percentage points of GDP. Only in the case of Uruguay, we have 0.35 percentage points of GDP, which is more on par with these first-generation carbon tax countries. So from there, we brought out our magical economist wand, and we said, well, what if we had the power to design a carbon tax for countries in the region where we would consider a price of $50 per ton? It's a number that has been running up in some of the literature. And what if we do a wider tax base? So basically, including electricity, transportation, and manufacturing, we would be covering around 46% of emissions in the region. And as you can see, the magic of a higher P and a higher Q gives us higher revenues. And on average, for these countries we did the estimations, we would be talking around 1.4 percentage points of GDP. I mean, this is a very important number. I mean, it's not little. Tax reforms in Latin America for the last 10, 15 years, they have yielded around 1 to 1.5% of GDP points. So yeah, this could potentially be equivalent to what you could raise through a tax reform in the region. So now that we know this, we took a step back and we said, okay, let's go back to the model and let's do a recycling exercise. And for this recycling exercise, just arbitrarily, let's decide that 70% of the revenues go into investments, and 30% of revenues go into transfers for vulnerable households, right? And this is an important policy question that needs to be taken into account. I don't know what's the exact or the right policy mix, but it's a mix that needs to be taken into consideration. So after running the model again with these revenues, recycling within the model, our first question is like, well, how much of this additional investment, and now I'm going for the whole average of 2024 to 2050, how much of this additional investment could be potentially financed through this carbon tax? And we're talking of about a tenth, right? A tenth of the financing requirement. Putting that investment back into the model gives us an improvement in the growth trajectory of, well, let's say 1/10 of a point. 1/10 of a point of GDP growth. So that figure that we saw at the beginning, where GDP in the worst scenario, in the 4.9 degree scenario, would be 0.2% in 2050, would improve to 0.3% in 2050. So there's an improvement. And now with that, let me just conclude by going directly into more specific policy questions. So the first thing is that trying to assess the feasibility of doing these carbon taxes at a high level in a developing region like Latin America. It would imply basically increasing the price tenfold and an important increase on the tax base. Is that politically feasible? I don't know. I think it's a complicated answer. There are many different experiences in Latin America where trying to do things that impact fuel prices and fuel subsidies and so on have basically led to the fall of governments. And Latin America is not the only case. It has happened also in other places in the world. But it's important to know that these revenues are important, but they're not a silver bullet. There is going to be a need for countries to do stronger changes or improvements in their domestic resource mobility to be able to finance these expenditures. And also very important from the international community, but international financial institutions, it's very important to basically assimilate that they have a very important role in being able to provide financing, long-term financing for countries to be able to embark in these carbon investments in the long run. And there's an additional thing also, not only for IFIs, but also for the rest of the international community. It's important that we take a role in helping countries in our regions improve their technical capacities and the technical analysis that they do, because this is information. I mean, these estimates are quite gross, right? But it's important to have an idea of how these potential fiscal risks will impact fiscal sustainability and also the growth trajectory in the medium term. Thank you.